The five-star general froze the moment he saw the coin in my hand. A second earlier, the command hall had been full of noise, boots on marble, officers talking, metals catching the light under the bright ceiling lamps. Then his eyes dropped to the small black coin resting in my palm, and the entire room went silent. He stepped closer, staring at it as if someone had just placed a ghost from history in front of him. "Where did you get that?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but every officer nearby heard it. I straightened automatically. "It belonged to my grandfather, sir. Elias Vance. He died last month." The general's face drained of color. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he turned toward the security officers. "Seal this room," he ordered. And that was the moment I realized something terrifying. The old veteran my parents called a failure was someone the highest command in the military had never forgotten. The call came late at night while I was still on base. My phone vibrated against the metal desk, the hospital's number glowing on the screen. I already knew what the nurse was going to say before I answered. "Captain Elena Vance?" she asked gently. "Yes. I'm calling about your grandfather. His condition has worsened. If you want to see him, you should come now." The drive across the city felt longer than usual. The streets were nearly empty, and the cold wind pushed loose paper across the sidewalks under the streetlights. My grandfather had been admitted to that public hospital 3 days earlier, and every doctor who spoke to me used the same careful phrase. "He's very tired." When I arrived, the hallway outside his room smelled like disinfectant and stale air. A nurse behind the desk looked up as I approached. "You must be Captain Vance," she said softly. "Yes." She hesitated before speaking again. "You're the only family member who came." I gave a small nod. "That's normal." Inside the room, my grandfather looked smaller than I remembered. The hospital bed seemed too large for him, the thin blanket barely covering his shoulders. His gray hair rested unevenly against the pillow, and the deep lines across his face made him appear older than 80. But when I stepped closer, his eyes opened immediately. "Elena," he said quietly. "I'm here, Grandpa." I pulled a chair beside the bed. The heart monitor beeped softly beside us. "I called Mom and Dad," I told him. He didn't seem surprised. "They're busy," he said. Earlier that evening, I had called both of them as soon as the hospital warned me his condition had worsened. My mother answered first. Music and conversation filled the background behind her voice. "Sweetheart, we're hosting a dinner tonight," she said impatiently. "Your father invited several investors." I tried to explain. "The doctors think he might not make it through the night." She sighed loudly. "Elena, your grandfather has been sick for years. He chose to live that kind of life. We can't cancel everything because of it." When my father took the phone, his response was even shorter. "Handle it," he said. "That's what you're there for." Then the call ended. Now, sitting beside the hospital bed, I felt the same quiet frustration returning. "They didn't come," I said softly. My grandfather gave a faint smile. "I didn't expect them to." For most of my life, my parents had described him the same way. A failed veteran, a stubborn old soldier who spent decades serving in a career that never made him rich or powerful. While they built their business empire and surrounded themselves with expensive homes and elegant parties, my grandfather lived alone in a small house outside the city, repairing old machines. To them, he was an embarrassment. To me, he was the only person who ever believed I could become something better. His hand moved slowly beneath the blanket and reached toward the jacket folded on the chair beside the bed. After a moment, he pulled something from the pocket. A coin. The metal looked dark, almost black under the hospital lights. He placed it in my palm and closed my fingers around it. "Keep it," he whispered. I turned the coin slightly under the light. A strange symbol had been engraved in the center, something that looked like the eye of a storm. "What is it?" I asked. His fingers tightened briefly around my hand. "Don't let them see it." "Who?" But he didn't answer. The heart monitor beside the bed slowed into uneven beeps. A nurse entered a few minutes later and checked the machine quietly. I stood beside the bed while she gently pulled the blanket higher across his chest. "I'm sorry," she said. 3 days later, we buried him at a small cemetery outside the city. The funeral was simple. 2 neighbors attended. 3 old veterans stood near the grave and saluted when the coffin was lowered into the ground. My parents didn't come. Instead, my mother sent a message. "When you're finished, go clean out his house. We're selling the property next week." Standing beside the grave, I held the black coin tightly in my hand and watched the last shovel of dirt fall across the coffin. At that moment, I believed exactly what my parents had always told me, that my grandfather had died the way he lived, poor, forgotten, and alone. I had no idea the small black coin in my pocket was about to prove every one of them wrong. The house already looked different when I arrived. My grandfather's small property sat at the edge of town, surrounded by old trees that had grown tall enough to block most of the road from view. I had spent countless weekends there when I was younger, fixing broken lawn equipment with him or listening to his quiet stories about machines that refused to behave the way they were supposed to. Now the place looked like it had been emptied by strangers. 2 trucks were parked outside the driveway, and several men were carrying boxes out through the front door and stacking them near the curb. Furniture, tools, and old metal parts were piled together in a careless heap that looked more like a junk collection than the remains of someone's life. I stepped out of the car slowly. "What's going on here?" One of the workers shrugged. "House clearance," he said. "We were hired this morning." "By who?" He pointed toward the driveway. My parents' car was parked there. I walked toward the front door and found my mother standing inside the living room, speaking with a real estate agent who was holding a clipboard. "Elena," she said when she saw me. "Perfect timing." "Why are there strangers emptying Grandpa's house?" She waved a hand dismissively. "We're preparing it for sale." My father stepped out of the kitchen, holding a folder of documents. "The market is strong right now," he added calmly. "There's no reason to keep this place sitting unused." I looked around the room. The old couch where my grandfather used to read had already been dragged outside. The wooden table where we ate dinner together when I was younger was leaning against the wall beside a pile of tools. "You didn't even wait," I said quietly. My mother frowned slightly. "Elena, the funeral was 3 days ago. There's no reason to delay practical decisions." "Practical," I repeated. My father opened the folder and handed several papers to the agent. "We'll list the property immediately," he said. "The land alone is worth more than the house." I walked past them without answering and headed toward the back of the house. The basement door stood open. That room had always been my grandfather's workshop. It smelled faintly of metal dust and machine oil, the same scent that used to cling to his clothes whenever he repaired old equipment for neighbors who couldn't afford professional mechanics. Now, even that room looked disturbed. Shelves had been emptied, boxes lay open on the floor. Someone had clearly begun sorting through his belongings before deciding most of them weren't worth keeping. I knelt near the old fireplace, where my grandfather sometimes kept small tools hidden behind loose bricks. One brick looked slightly out of place. When I pulled it free, a narrow metal compartment appeared behind the stone. Inside sat a small steel box. The metal surface was scratched and darkened with age, but the latch still worked perfectly when I opened it. Inside the box were only 2 things: a folded envelope and the same black coin my grandfather had placed in my hand at the hospital. I lifted the coin and studied it again. The metal was matte black, heavier than a normal challenge coin, and completely blank except for the strange symbol engraved at its center. The mark looked like a spiral surrounding a single eye, a storm's eye. Footsteps echoed behind me. "What are you doing down here?" my mother asked. I turned slightly and showed her the coin. This was Grandpa's. She glanced at it briefly and laughed. "That thing? You've seen it before?" "Of course," she said. He used to carry it around like it was something important. My father stepped into the room behind her and looked at the coin with open amusement. Probably something he picked up at a flea market, he said. He was always collecting strange junk. It doesn't look like junk, I replied. My mother crossed her arms. Elena, your grandfather spent years pretending small things had meaning. That's what people do when they don't have anything real to show for their lives. Her words landed harder than she probably intended. I looked back down at the coin resting in my palm. It didn't feel cheap. It felt deliberate, almost official, but my parents had already turned away. Finish whatever you're doing, my father said as he walked toward the stairs. The buyers are visiting next week, so the house needs to be empty by then. The basement grew quiet again after they left. For a moment I stood there staring at the coin. Then I slipped it into my pocket. 10 days later, the house was sold. My parents moved forward with their plans as if the place had never mattered, as if the man who lived there had simply been a minor inconvenience that had finally removed itself from their lives. But every time I held the coin in my hand, I felt the same strange certainty growing stronger. My grandfather had asked me to hide it, and men like him didn't hide meaningless objects. I just didn't know yet what the coin was meant to reveal. I didn't plan to attend the ceremony. The invitation had arrived weeks earlier through military channels, announcing a formal gathering for several decorated officers and veterans at a large military hall near the capital. Events like that usually followed a predictable script: speeches, medals, polite applause, and quiet conversations about careers that had already passed into history. Normally, I would have ignored it, but the black coin in my pocket kept returning to my thoughts. For days I had turned it over in my hand, studying the strange storm-shaped symbol engraved into the metal. The more I looked at it, the more convinced I became that it wasn't a souvenir or a meaningless trinket like my parents believed. It carried the weight and design of something official, something created for people who understood exactly what it represented. And if anyone recognized it, that ceremony seemed like the place to find them. The military hall was already crowded when I arrived. Uniforms filled the room in every direction, rows of decorated officers moving between tables while veterans spoke quietly near the walls. Medals reflected the bright overhead lights, and the low hum of conversation made the entire space feel alive with history. For several minutes, I simply walked through the hall, watching faces and listening to fragments of conversations about deployments, strategy briefings, and past missions. No one noticed the coin. Then the announcer's voice echoed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome General Marcus Vane. The room reacted instantly. Conversations stopped. Chairs shifted. Every officer in the hall stood as the tall figure of a man in a dark uniform walked slowly toward the stage. His posture carried the calm authority of someone who had spent decades commanding people who trusted his decisions without hesitation. 5 silver stars rested on his shoulders. General Marcus Vane was one of the most respected commanders in the entire military. When the applause faded, the ceremony continued with several speeches about leadership and service. I listened politely, but my attention kept drifting back to the coin in my pocket. Eventually, the formal program ended, and people began moving around the hall again. That was when I saw him standing near one of the side corridors. The general was speaking quietly with several officers when I approached. I hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. General Vane, sir. He turned. Yes, Captain? I held out my hand. There's something I believe you should see. The coin rested in my palm. For a moment he didn't react. Then his eyes focused on the black metal. Everything about his posture changed. The general took a slow step closer, his gaze locked on the strange storm symbol engraved in the center of the coin. The surrounding officers fell silent as they noticed his expression. Where did you get that? He asked quietly. It belonged to my grandfather. The general looked up sharply. What was his name? Elias Vance. For several seconds, he didn't speak. Then he gestured toward the corridor behind him. Come with me. The hallway outside the main hall was empty and quiet. The general closed the door behind us and turned back toward me, studying the coin again as if confirming something he had hoped never to see. "You said this belonged to Elias Vance," he said slowly. "Yes, sir. He passed away last month." The general lowered his head briefly. "When?" "3 weeks ago." He exhaled slowly. I wondered why the signal stopped. I frowned slightly. "What signal?" The general looked at me carefully. "Captain Vance, what did your family tell you about your grandfather?" The question caught me off guard. "They said he was a retired soldier," I answered. "Someone who never achieved much?" A faint, humorless smile crossed the general's face. "That sounds exactly like Elias." He walked to the window at the end of the hallway and stood there for a moment before speaking again. "Your grandfather didn't fail in the military," he said quietly. "He led one of the most classified operational groups we have ever had." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" He turned back toward me. "The symbol on that coin represents a unit known as Stormeye." I glanced down at the coin. "Stormeye?" "A group assigned to missions that officially never happened," the general explained. "Operations where success could never be publicly acknowledged and failure would erase every name connected to it." The hallway suddenly felt much smaller. "You're saying my grandfather was the architect of that unit," the general finished. The words hung in the air. For a moment, I struggled to reconcile the image of the quiet old man who repaired broken engines in a small garage with the commander the general was describing. But my parents always said he was poor. General Vane's expression darkened slightly. "Yes," he said. "That was also deliberate." He stepped closer. "Your parents built their business using investment capital that appeared mysteriously 15 years ago, didn't they?" I blinked. "Yes." "How do you know that?" "Because Elias arranged it." The statement hit harder than anything else he had said. "Your grandfather used nearly all of his military pension and private savings to quietly pay off your father's business debts after a failed investment," the general continued. "He created an anonymous investment channel that allowed your parents to rebuild their company without ever knowing where the money came from." I felt the air leave my lungs. "You're telling me he saved them?" "For 15 years, the general said. "And they never knew?" "No." The hallway fell silent. Finally, I looked down at the coin again. "Why did he give me this?" The general's expression softened slightly. "Because that coin was never meant to be a souvenir," he said. "It's a key." My parents arrived at the headquarters wearing their best smiles. The invitation they received had been written in formal military language, and it carried the signature of General Marcus Vane himself. My father interpreted that detail as proof that his reputation had finally reached the highest levels of command. By the time they stepped into the building's reception hall, both of them looked completely confident that the meeting would somehow benefit them. My mother adjusted the sleeve of her jacket while looking around the polished lobby. "I told you the government would eventually recognize what we've built," she said quietly. "Our investment firm has done very well this year." My father nodded. "It's about time someone important noticed." They did not see me standing near the corridor outside the conference room. When they finally noticed, their expressions shifted briefly from surprise to annoyance. "Elena," my mother said, "what are you doing here?" "I was asked to attend." My father frowned slightly. "By who?" Before I could answer, the door to the conference room opened. General Marcus Vane stepped out. Both of my parents straightened immediately, their posture changing with the kind of exaggerated respect civilians often display around high-ranking officers. "General Vane," my father said, extending his hand confidently. "It's an honor." The general looked at the offered hand but didn't shake it. Instead, he gestured toward the conference table inside the room. "Please sit." The room itself was quiet and formal. A long wooden table stretched across the center, and several officers sat along one side reviewing documents. My parents took their seats opposite them, still smiling as if they were attending a business negotiation rather than something far more serious. The general remained standing for a moment. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance," he began calmly, "do you know why I invited you here today?" My father leaned back comfortably in his chair. "I assumed it had something to do with our company," he said. "We've worked with several government contractors recently." The general nodded slightly. "Yes," he said. "You have?" My mother folded her hands neatly on the table. "Our investment network has expanded significantly over the past decade," she added. "We've been fortunate." The general opened a folder and removed several pages. "Yes," he repeated. "Very fortunate." He placed the documents in front of them. "These are financial records covering the last 15 years of your company's growth." My father glanced at the first page casually. "That information should already be public." "It is." The general paused before continuing. "What interests me is the original capital used to rebuild your company after the bankruptcy in 2008. My father's expression stiffened slightly. "That was private investment." "Yes," the general said. "Anonymous investment." My mother's smile faded a little. "That happens in business." The general turned one of the pages toward them. "This account shows a series of financial transfers beginning 15 years ago. The money arrived through an intermediary investment channel that concealed the donor's identity." My father tapped the page impatiently. "If you already know this information, I'm not sure why we're discussing it." The general finally sat down across from them. "Because the donor was not anonymous." The room grew quieter. My father looked confused. "What do you mean?" General Vane folded his hands. "The money came from Elias Vance." The reaction was immediate. My mother laughed once, the sound sharp and dismissive. "That's impossible." My father shook his head. "My father-in-law was practically broke his entire life." The general slid another document across the table. "These are military pension records and private accounts belonging to Elias Vance. Over 15 years, he quietly transferred nearly every dollar he earned into the investment channel that rebuilt your company." My father stared at the paper. "That doesn't make sense." "No," the general agreed. "It doesn't make sense if you believe the story you told yourselves about him." My mother's voice hardened. "He lived like a mechanic in a broken house." "Yes," the general replied, "because he spent most of his income keeping your business alive." The silence in the room grew heavier. My father slowly lowered the document. "You're telling me my company was built with his money?" "Your company was saved by his money." The general leaned forward slightly. "There is one more detail you should know." He removed a final sheet from the folder. "Elias Vance established a trust connected to those investments. The trust included a verification clause, something he referred to as a character condition." My mother frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means the trust would remain active only if the family demonstrated loyalty toward him during his final years." My father looked up sharply. "And if they didn't?" The general's voice remained calm. "Then the trust would close, and all remaining assets would transfer to the alternate heir." My parents both turned toward me at the same time. For the first time since entering the room, their confidence disappeared completely. My father spoke slowly. "You're saying—" General Vane finished the sentence for him. "The moment you chose not to visit him during his final days, the clause activated." My mother's face had gone pale. "What happens to the accounts?" The general slid the final document across the table. "They now belong to Captain Elena Vance." The room fell silent. For 15 years, my parents believed they had built their fortune through intelligence and determination. Now they were learning the truth. Every success they celebrated had been quietly financed by the man they abandoned. And the man they called a failure had just taken everything back. The second funeral happened 1 month later. This time, my grandfather was not buried quietly. The ceremony took place at a military cemetery outside the capital, a place reserved for soldiers whose service carried weight the public rarely understood. Rows of uniformed officers stood in silence beneath a pale gray sky, while the honor guard carried the coffin forward with slow, precise steps. The flag covering the coffin moved gently in the cold wind. General Marcus Vane stood beside me. Neither of us spoke while the soldiers positioned the casket above the grave. The quiet discipline of the ceremony felt completely different from the small funeral weeks earlier, when only a few neighbors had stood beside the grave. Now dozens of veterans had gathered. Some of them were old enough to have served during the same era as my grandfather. Others were younger officers who had only heard stories about the mysterious unit known as Storm Eye. But every one of them stood at attention. He would have hated this attention, I said quietly. General Vane allowed himself a faint smile. That is usually how the best soldiers feel about recognition. The honor guard raised their rifles. The sharp sound of the volley echoed across the cemetery, cutting through the morning air before fading into silence. Moments later, the bugler began to play taps, the slow melody drifting across the rows of white headstones. Every soldier present raised their salute. When the music ended, an officer stepped forward and carefully folded the American flag that had covered the coffin. He handed it to me with the traditional words of gratitude for my grandfather's service. I accepted the flag and held it tightly. For most of my life, I believe my grandfather had lived a quiet, unremarkable life, repairing machines in a small workshop while my parents built their successful business. Now, I finally understood the truth. He had simply chosen a different kind of success, one that required silence. Before the grave was closed, I reached into my pocket and removed the black coin he had given me in the hospital. The metal felt heavy in my hand, the storm-shaped symbol still dark and mysterious under the morning light. General Vane looked at it briefly. "That coin opened many doors during his lifetime," he said. I nodded. "But I think its job is finished now." I stepped forward and placed the coin gently on the coffin. Then the first shovels of soil fell. The wind moved softly across the cemetery, while the soldiers slowly returned to their vehicles. Within minutes, the field grew quiet again, leaving only the long rows of white stones stretching across the hillside. My grandfather had lived most of his life in that same kind of quiet. He never chased recognition. He never demanded gratitude. Instead, he spent years protecting people who would never know his name. And even when his own family abandoned him, he continued helping them from the shadows. As I turned to leave the cemetery, I realized something important. True strength is rarely loud. Sometimes the greatest soldiers are the ones who carry the heaviest responsibilities without ever asking the world to notice. My grandfather understood that. He lived by it. And in the end, that quiet discipline became the greatest legacy he left behind. If this story reminded you of a veteran in your own family, take a moment to honor them while you still can. Because sometimes the people we overlook today are the heroes history will remember tomorrow. And if you believe silent service deserves recognition, type legacy in the comments below.